You might think you know this story. In the early 90s, someone named Chris Houlihan won a contest and got his name hidden in a secret room in Zelda, A Link to the Past. But what if I told you that some people doubt that Chris Houlihan ever won that contest, and that maybe he doesn't even exist? The story of Chris Houlihan is tricky to break down because it's really a mystery in a mystery. April 13th, 1992. Zelda, A Link to the Past is released in North America. It's hard to tell exactly when, but pretty early on, some players make a discovery. Sometimes, for reasons that no one understands, when Link tries to enter certain areas, he is instead sent to a different room. It's a nice little surprise. There's some money on the floor, and a sign that reads, "My name is Chris Houlihan. This is my secret room. Keep it between us, okay?" For a while, most people doubted the existence of the room at all. It was extremely rare to find it by accident. Even people who found it didn't know how to get back to it again. For years, it existed as nothing but a rumor, another Mew under the truck. This was back before the internet, so it was often treated as one of those "my uncle works for Nintendo" type stories. But even at this time, people wanted to know, who was Chris Houlihan? Why did he have a secret room? Was he a Zelda character, a game designer having a laugh, or something else? I'm not entirely clear how or when someone made the connection, but eventually people began pointing to a contest that had run years earlier in Nintendo's magazine, Nintendo Power. Back in September of 1990, they had launched a contest with the reward of getting your name printed in an upcoming Nintendo game. Chris had apparently won. So that's the answer, right? Case closed. I know that's what I thought the first time I heard of it. I came across instructions for accessing the room sometime in the early 2000s. I tried it out, thought it was kinda neat, and I went on with my life. A few months ago, I thought it might be a cool topic for a video, and I wondered what had ever happened to Chris. What did he think of the secret room? Was it really his secret for years before people found it? Did he have to find it himself? But here's the thing. Chris Houlihan has never commented on the room. He's never done an interview, never made a statement. I tried to see if he was ever in another issue of Nintendo Power, or if some other website had ever done a follow-up story. And to be clear, people have been looking. For 20 years, people have been asking who this guy is and what happened to him. As I went through old videos, web articles, and online discussions, I kept coming across more and more people absolutely positive that not only did Chris Houlihan never win any contest, they're sure that he's not even a real person. So let's go back to the very beginning. May 1990. Final Fantasy I gets its US release. A few months later, in September of 1990, Nintendo Power has a contest challenging readers to send in a photograph of them encountering a rare enemy called the War Mech. The reward is to get your name in a future Nintendo game. We'll get into the contest in more detail later. The deadline for the contest comes and goes, and silence. Nintendo never announced the winner to the contest, and never said what game the winner's name would be in. Years go by. In 1992, Zelda: A Link to the Past is released in North America. Issue 34 of Nintendo Power is largely dedicated to Link to the Past. 14 pages of maps and hints, 16 pages of a Zelda comic, but there's still no mention of either Chris or the contest. In 1994, Nintendo broke their silence. Sort of. Club Nintendo was a customer loyalty program for Nintendo products. They also ran a number of magazines in different countries and were sort of the non-American version of Nintendo Power. In December of 1994, the Mexican edition of Club Nintendo magazine printed a letter where the writer describes encountering the secret room, their unsuccessful attempts to replicate the experience, and asks for an explanation. In their response, Club Nintendo writes that they had also received a letter from another player who had encountered the same room when trying to enter Ganon's pyramid. They say that they had contacted Nintendo directly, and their response was, "Chris Houlihan is the name of the boy who won a Nintendo Power contest, and the prize was that they would include his name somewhere in the game Zelda: A Link to the Past." They go on to say that they are still unsure of a reliable way to trigger the appearance of the room, and they offer a small prize to anyone that can find one. 4 more years go by. Finally, in February of 1998, Nintendo Power Volume 105 has a small article about a contest winner who had his face and voice put into the game Turok 2. When describing this contest, they mentioned the old contest from back in 1990. In 1992, Nintendo Power contest winner Chris Houlihan secured his place in gaming history by having his name featured in a hidden area in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. This single sentence is the only time the name Chris Houlihan has appeared in the American magazine, and to my knowledge, it's the only time the contest was ever mentioned again. So why the conspiracy? What is so odd about this whole situation? Why are so many people so suspicious? It boils down to a few different things. The first is the lack of any sort of record of Chris Houlihan at all. For example, I did a short video about the guy who won a contest by proving he was the first person to beat the original Legend of Zelda. Finding a few articles on him took a matter of minutes. I've come across people who search through public records for anyone named Chris Houlihan, which I think is kinda overdoing it, but even they haven't had any luck. Weird thing number 2 is Nintendo Power's near total silence on the whole thing. No updates on the contest, and they never mention it again until 8 years later. Some people also take issue with the room itself. I'm not going to go too far into the technical details, there's plenty of articles and videos about how the room works and how to get to it, but the simple version is that the room doesn't really have a location in the game world. Instead, it seems to act as sort of a safety net. The methods to trigger it on purpose mostly involve confusing the game on your position by pushing yourself around with bombs or the dash boots before dropping into a hole. When the game doesn't know where to send the player, instead of crashing, it drops them into Chris's room. This is the reason it took so long to even confirm that it existed. Some people feel like this is a weird place to put the special prize-winning name. The game is full of secret caves and rooms that could hold the name, there's lots of random NPCs that could introduce themselves as Chris Houlihan, so why put it in this glitchy area that was next to impossible to find? Personally, I'm not super interested in doxing someone who doesn't want to be found, and searching for the real Chris Houlihan seemed really difficult, so instead I focus my investigative energies on the contest and the room. Nintendo Power's silence is, I think, the strangest part of this mystery. The contest was a great marketing gimmick, both for the game and for the magazine itself. What 90s kid wouldn't want a subscription to Nintendo Power after hearing they put a reader in the new Zelda? So is it really that odd that Nintendo Power never announced a winner or promoted the contest more? Actually, yes. Nintendo Power was full of contests. They were running constantly. Free games, t-shirts, other merchandise, weird collectibles, chances to visit movie sets or meet celebrities. Pretty much every issue had a big list of names of all the winners of various challenges. The more interesting contests would have whole articles, or at least a little blurb about it. One thing I never see mentioned when people talk about this contest is that it was actually just a small part of a larger contest. Nintendo Power had been doing a run of these Final Fantasy contests for a few months with random draws where you had to answer a few questions to enter. Chris's contest was a spin-off of this. In the same issue, there's another Final Fantasy contest promising to fly the winner and 3 of their friends to an island where they'd go on sort of a treasure hunt adventure emulating part of the game. The runner-ups would get a crystal orb similar to ones found in the game. It seemed to me that investigating one part of the contest could lead to information on the other. Now, it's easy to see that the runner-up orbs went out. They pop up for sale once in a while online. One orb made a bit of a stir back in 2010 when someone tried to sell it for $250,000. Another one actually did sell for about $1,300. But I was more interested in the big treasure hunt prize. Did it ever get resolved? I was able to track down the winner of the island adventure from an old Reddit comment he had made talking about the experience years ago. When I contacted him, he was able to confirm that yes, he was real, and yes, he really did get to go on his trip. He also helpfully pointed out the article written in issue 23, that was April 1991, that talked about his trip. Somehow this only seemed to confuse things more. First off, once again, it was pretty easy to track down a contest winner who was happy to talk about their experience, while Chris Houlihan remains completely hidden. But more importantly, the other Final Fantasy contests from the same issue definitely happened. The winners got their prizes, everyone's happy, they wrote an article about it. So why did Nintendo announce the winner for this contest, and not the other one? The obvious answer is that they couldn't. A popular theory is that nobody won the naming contest, and that Chris Houlihan is just a made-up name. A big part of this theory is just how difficult the contest actually was. Final Fantasy I was released in North America in May of 1990. The contest started only a few months later in September. The deadline for the contest was only 2 months after that in November. That is not a lot of time. Let's talk about the War Mech for a second, the secret enemy that you had to find in order to win the contest. It only appears in one very small area near the end of the game. There's one bridge where it's possible to encounter it, with only a 1 in 64 chance that you'll fight it instead of another enemy. The odds that a random player will find it by accident are pretty low. The contest does give the hint that he never wanders far from Tiamat, which at least told players the general location, but I could very easily see someone uselessly wandering around a different area of the same dungeon. Remember, this is before you could just look up stuff on the internet. Nintendo Power themselves were probably the best source of help most kids had at the time. Final Fantasy was not an easy game either. It could be really grindy, and it was pretty big for the time. Remember, if someone got it right when it was released in May, they only had till November 1st, about 5 months later, to find the War Mech, take a picture, and mail it in. The game only had one save slot, and the area of the War Mech is inaccessible once you finish that part of the game. So Chris would have had to master the game enough in those months that he could get to the War Mech, possibly restarting the game and playing it up to that point in only 2 months since the start of the contest, then be clever or lucky enough to encounter the War Mech and to take a picture and send it in. I have read a lot of online discussions arguing about how difficult finding a War Mech actually is. It seems at least possible that there just wasn't an entry that managed to pull it off in the tight timeline given by the contest. So that's theory number 1. No one won the contest, Nintendo Power simply didn't get a winning entry, no one sent in a picture, so Nintendo just quietly let the matter drop, didn't mention it again. So where did the name Chris Houlihan come from? Perhaps it was a placeholder, a random name someone typed in that never got removed. Maybe it's unrelated, could be a hilarious inside joke left over by someone who worked on the game. The Japanese version of the game has no mention of Chris Houlihan, or any other person. The room is there along with the sign, but in this case it just describes it as a secret room. This goes for every other language version of the game. Only the English version has any sort of name. I think this might also explain why this location, out of all other places, is where the Chris Houlihan room went. In older games, the text is not usually stored in a nicely ordered format. It tends to get mixed and rearranged and given to translators in like a giant text file. Translators often don't have a ton of context of where a given piece of text goes or what order it goes in. They also need to be careful about changing the length of a piece of text too much, as it can lead to errors in the game. So if you're a translator who's just been told you need to insert a name into the game, but you can't do anything that might confuse important text, you're looking at a big list of all the text in the game, NPC dialogue, signs, so on. But it's all sort of scrambled together. You see one that just describes the fact that you're in a secret room. No character names, no important plot points. Seems like an easy place to put that name. So maybe someone stuck it in there without really knowing exactly what the room was. They didn't have any reason to think it was some weird glitchy area that would be near impossible to find, and assumed it was just one of the many secret areas in the game. I figured there was one person who would know the answer for sure. The person who must have actually typed that name into the text box. The game credits show Daniel Olsen as the person who did the English localization. Olsen wrote the screen text for Link to the Past. He also worked on quite a few other games, including classics like Earthbound and Super Metroid. In fact, it's his voice you hear at the very start of the game.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
So, I sent him a message explaining this conspiracy and how he might be the only one who could blow the lid off this thing. If he could just tell us where the name came from, we could finally get to the bottom of this. But Daniel Osen never replied. Was this a cover-up? Either Daniel Osen had something to hide, or he was too busy to answer dumb questions from a random guy on YouTube. It was impossible to say. So where does this leave us? Theory number 1, nothing to see here. Maybe there is nothing hidden here. The generally accepted story is correct. Chris won the contest, got his name in the game. For whatever reason, he never came forward publicly to talk about it. Nintendo Power either forgot about the contest or just decided it wasn't worth the space in the magazine to cover it further. Too boring, and the whole thing is just weird enough that I'm not buying it. Theory number 2, the fake Chris theory. The contest was never won, and at some point they just stuck a random name in there. Then Nintendo Power avoided drawing attention to the contest. There is no Chris Houlihan, and there never was. This one's pretty popular, but personally, I don't agree with most of the theories about a made-up Chris and an unwinnable contest. The War Mech contest was tricky, and players didn't have a ton of time to do it, but it was far from impossible. Nintendo Power had 6 million readers in 1990. I couldn't get exact sales data on Final Fantasy, but there were 700,000 copies sold in North America by 1994. So there had to be like tens of thousands of people with access to both the magazine and the game at the time of the contest. With that many people, someone's bound to pull it off. The thing that really sank this theory for me is when I tried to track down all the resources that a player at this time would have access to. Final Fantasy was a tricky game, but players also had a lot of help. The game came with an 87-page manual that walks the player through the first few challenges, as well as maps, lists of equipment, spells, enemy stats. Nintendo Power themselves had put out a few guides that went even further. Issue 17 of Nintendo Power was released halfway through the contest. The whole thing was basically one giant strategy guide. 80 more pages of maps, guides, detailed strategies, and on page 73 is a small section titled War Mech's Bridge that explains exactly where to find it. Players wouldn't have had a ton of time to use this guide before the end of the contest, but the last issue already told them the right dungeon to find the War Mech. If players made it here but were having trouble finding the exact place to get it, this told them precisely where to look. I have to assume that at least one person with all of these resources would be able to win the contest. I do think it's a little odd that Chris has never been tracked down for an interview, but it's not that strange. Maybe he grew up to be a serious person with a serious job and just isn't interested in talking about a decades-old video game contest. Maybe he just plain doesn't remember ever doing it. The real puzzling thing to me is Nintendo Power never doing any announcements or follow-ups. I think there must be a reason they chose to ignore this story. That brings us to Theory 3. Something happened to Chris. This basically says that something is preventing Chris from being found. This gets wild. I've seen everything from maybe he just passed away at some point, to maybe he witnessed a mob hit, went into witness protection, then the FBI gave him a new identity, scrubbed his old one, and the only remaining trace of his old life is this little room in The Legend of Zelda. Let's focus on the more plausible idea that Chris Houlihan has passed away. Lots of people pick this as the reason that Chris is so quiet today, but what if tragically something happened to Chris between entering the contest and the release of Zelda? I can imagine a situation where Chris wins the contest, Nintendo Power passes his name on to whoever is going to put his name in the game, and then Chris dies before the game comes out. Nintendo Power and/or Chris's family decide that a follow-up article is in poor taste, so it's never brought up until years later, possibly by someone who knew the main details of the contest, but not the more tragic information about Chris himself. I consider this one to be pretty plausible, but also pretty depressing, so let's move on. Let's talk about a few of my own theories. Theory number 4 I like to call the Canadian Chris theory. Basically, I propose that Chris Houlihan really did win the contest, he is a real person, In fact, he might have been the only person to win the contest. But there is one small problem. Chris is Canadian. And like many American contests, this one expressly forbids Canadians from entering. Chris's name gets passed along to whoever is putting the name in Zelda before the problem is noticed. Then when Zelda is about to be released, the mistake is discovered. Chris is ineligible. I'm not familiar with the specifics, but there actually are a lot of rules and regulations about contests and giveaways. Nintendo Power voids his entry, doesn't write an article about him or announce him as the winner, but it's too late to take his name out of the game. No one looking through old records can find Chris, since they're looking in the wrong country. This theory works for really any small thing that would disqualify him on a technicality. Maybe he barely missed a deadline, maybe he had the picture but not the required skill testing questions. Anything small that might not have been caught right away. Theory number 5, I like to call the switcheroo. Of course, there's always a chance the whole contest just got lost in the shuffle of running a busy magazine. Imagine Chris won, his name gets passed on to whoever puts it in the game, but somehow the magazine just plain forgot about it before the game came out. It's possible, but it seems kinda hard to believe. But what if something happened to complicate matters? It always seemed a little odd to me that a contest in the middle of this big Final Fantasy push ended up with a Zelda prize. Remember, the contest didn't specify what game the winner would be in. So what if there was a different game that was supposed to be the prize? But what game would make sense? The obvious answer is Final Fantasy II. Now, you guys are watching a video about a secret room in a 30-year-old Nintendo game, so I'm going to assume you're pretty familiar with the wacky numbering of the Final Fantasy series. But here's a quick refresher just in case. Final Fantasy I was released in both Japan and North America, but they skipped the American release of number 2 and number 3. Eventually, North America got Final Fantasy IV, but to keep the numbering consistent, they called it Final Fantasy II. They skipped number 5 and then released 6, but called it 3. When they released Final Fantasy VII, they finally just mashed up the numbers, and it's all been the same from there. So let's roll back a bit one more time. The War Mech contest was in 1990, just a few months after Final Fantasy I had come out in North America. But in Japan, it was already 3 years old, having been released back in '87. In fact, Japan had already had the sequel, Final Fantasy II, for 2 years at this point, since it was released in 1988. After the somewhat surprising success of Final Fantasy I in North America, plans were made to release Final Fantasy II as well. A translation was started, but the project was cancelled in 1991. Link to the Past was released a year later. I wonder if the original plan for the contest prize was to put the winner's name in Final Fantasy II, but there was maybe some rumblings about a possible cancellation, so they kept the contest open-ended. Then, when that game was cancelled a year later, they put it into Zelda instead. Final Fantasy II, which was actually Final Fantasy IV, was released 7 months after Zelda. If the original prize was for Final Fantasy II, which was cancelled, but then a different Final Fantasy II released later, could this have caused enough confusion that someone just plain forgot what game the contest was attached to? It seems silly, but I could picture someone juggling a bunch of different contests, getting ready to write an article when Final Fantasy II releases, only to realize the game they should have been writing about already came out almost a year ago. At that point, it didn't make sense to write about the old contest, so they just quietly forgot about it. I'm not sure on this one. On one hand, it seems like a lot of stuff kind of had to line up perfectly for it to happen, but most of the timing does kind of fit, and it does seem just confusing and chaotic enough that I could see this actually being a real reason. My final and favorite theory is what I call the two secret room. Remember the 1994 letter in the Mexican magazine? While they confirm that Chris Houlihan's room is linked to the contest, it seems like even people at Nintendo weren't sure how to reliably access the Chris Houlihan room. Remember, it didn't have a real location, it was more of a bug checking thing that only worked when the game didn't know where it was actually supposed to be sending it. So I'm imagining a situation where Zelda's coming out, Nintendo Power wants to do a follow-up article about the contest, but there's one problem. No one actually knows how to find the room. Even if the developers tell them that they inserted the name into that room, there's no way to prove it or to demonstrate that it actually is readable by players. The magazine can't tell readers how to get to it, They can't even get in there to get a picture of it for the article, and they decide to just cut the follow-up until they're sure players can see the prize. By 1994, they know that people are occasionally finding the room, but since the only way you can find it is to blunder into it pretty much accidentally, they still really can't use it for an article. The earliest guide I could find of instructions for accessing the room comes from scans of a long-dead website dated as 1998. The same year Nintendo Power finally mentioned that Chris won the contest. And this is my final choice. No mysterious disappearing children, no fake contests, no aliases or cover-ups, just a simple problem that kept getting kicked down the road long enough that everybody mostly forgot about it. And that about covers it. What do you think? Does Chris Houlihan really exist, or was he a made-up placeholder name? Did Nintendo Power just forget about their contest? Or did something go so wrong they decided to bury it? Do you have a theory, or is there some other mystery you'd like me to investigate? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.